As is always the way with these breakfasts, we've got people from quite a diverse industry segment in terms of industry focus and different backgrounds. So what we're going to try and do is cover quite a lot of material. Our objective is to try and make sure that there's at least one thing that everyone can take out of today's session, take it back to your business, even if it's just a really good question to ask. If we don't achieve that objective, stay around at the end and I'm sure we can work through some other topics for you. Oops, sorry, here we go. So what I'd like to do is just build a bit more on Adam's introduction, just around how we're seeing the economic outlook and really what it means around supply chain. And it is an interesting time at the minute. There's definitely a lot of strong positives out there in the market, especially when we start to see at least consumer sentiment has remained relatively stable. We've got a much more aligned cost structure in most of our organisations to this market, quite different from a couple of years ago. We've got low interest rates and, as Adam mentioned, relatively stable unemployment, relatively low unemployment levels. Despite a lot of those positives, of course, the media seems to be consistently beating up how bad the economy is and the government talking it down a little bit at the minute. But I actually think it's much better than it's been, certainly since last year. The back end of last year was really problematic before the election, and there's a real sentiment certainly going around talking with clients at the minute that this environment is the one we've got to deal with and we need to move on. We can't just sit on our hands and let time pass. So that's been a marked change, I think, from before the federal election last year. There is ongoing uncertainty, the reduction potentially in government spending that's going to come through. Taxes are certainly going up for most of us. Domestic housing, a bit of uncertainty in there. And some of the international security incidents that could occur are sleepers, but they're certainly out there and things that we need to be aware of. But then, in terms of the opportunities, I think, the last week's been really interesting when you look at, what's been talked about in terms of some of the spending by the feds, so another 10 billion odd likely to come through in infrastructure. PEP, we're talking about the number of businesses that they're likely to spin back out of their portfolios, so a lot of IPO activity that's backed up. And for some industries, some of the new international trade deals, they haven't had a lot of focus in the media, but there are some fairly significant opportunities in there. There are the negatives, and again, Adam touched on some of the challenges for, in particular, manufacturing, the high Aussie dollar, which just won't go down, input costs, and in particular, input costs around labour, and the real need to try and get some labour efficiency, margin from retailers, and the need to replace capital is a real challenge. So that sector, really does have a lot of challenges within it. But across this mixture, I guess, of opportunity and risk, what we're seeing is companies now starting to come out on a bit of a growth story. So again, if I just look at the media in the last week, IKEA talking about re-engineering their supply chain, they're opening new format stores and being able to deliver direct through the internet to people's homes. Woolies out there talking about Mercury 2 and the planning that they're doing around that, and that'll be enable them to deliver across their different store formats and brands to consumers. We've also been seeing a couple of organisations looking at how do they invest in supply chain infrastructure to support growth, both from an organic sense and acquisition. Some of those things we didn't see much of realistically over the last couple of years, so I think they're a very positive sign. There is, though, that cost pressure that continues in the market, and again, if you flick through the annual reports, people like Arnott's, Goodman Fielder, etc., with really pretty strong cost reduction targets, which really reflects, the FMCG challenge. And I think we're going to see more pressure within mining. As projects have moved out of the development phase and are now into production, it becomes about cost per tonne. And again, there's some inefficiencies that have been built in through the boom that I think, will create supply chain re-engineering opportunities. So it is an interesting time. There was also an article in the paper yesterday that just talked about the mix of demand from consumers consumers. So no surprises, we're all buying more coffee and going to cafes. We're not doing so much of going to the butchers. So when you look across the mix of what's being demanded, whilst the headline number is modest growth, within that there's a real variety of both, growth and decline. So it's really that complexity that I think we need to be able to deal with in this environment. So really what we want to do today is to explore a bit more around what are the opportunities to really significantly derive some of the benefits from the supply chain. And lots of organisations have invested in technologies, we've invested in new distribution centres, we've invested in collaborative planning and the like. But some of the benefits just seem to not come through. We're just not quite getting to the prize that we thought we could achieve. And so what Carter's going to do is start to unpick some of the drivers and the opportunities that sit behind that, and really look at what are some of the benefits of getting it right. So what I might do is I'll pass over to Carter, who's going to take us through the next part of the presentation.
Thanks very much, James. Is the mic on? Yep, great.
That'd be yes.
That's you and I.
James and I amplify each other in all sorts of ways. Great. So thanks for that introduction, James. And what I want to do now is drill into a little bit more of the details. So James has talked about the fact that we've invested heavily in supply chain but haven't necessarily seen all the benefits. And one of the things that makes that challenging is the fact that getting supply chain right is a highly interdependent problem. So all of the elements on this slide have to have a reasonable degree of integration and sophistication to make it work. So if I just quickly go through this, one is we have to have a well-articulated business strategy. So we really have to understand what the business is trying to achieve and have that objectively defined. If we then take the next step from there, we have to have a well-defined customer value proposition. We actually have to know what our customer offer is. And something that we see pretty consistently is that there are, to some extent, views of what the customer offer are. But if you ask most businesses to say, how do you objectively define that? How do you actually service your A customers, your B customers, and your C customers? What are the response times and so on? Sometimes it's hard to enunciate. So sometimes we have maybe a lack of clarity in what the customer offer actually is. And if we don't have the clarity in the customer offer, then sometimes it's difficult to work out exactly how do we set up our supply chain to support that. Because really the supply chain is there to make sure the business strategy and the customer offer are delivered. And that's how we set that up. Once we have those components in place, we then have to look at the structures of the organization, org structure, roles and responsibilities and decision rights, the policies that govern activity and the KPIs. If we get it right, it can be quite a wonderful thing because some of our financial ratios, like return on capital employed, can have a multiplier effect if we improve supply chain performance, because we get a lift in revenue, particularly if we improve our time to market and our service levels. We've seen examples of organizations achieving a 5 to 10% increase in sales as a result of supply chain performance. Cash flow, asset utilization, working capital optimization can generate anywhere between a 10 to 40% improvement in that free cash flow, which is fantastic. You can use that to fund business initiatives, and it's cash you don't have to go out in the market to find. It's effectively free cash. But we've made investments in S&OP. Perhaps some of us don't know the term specifically, sales and operations planning. For those that don't, S&OP is simply a set of processes that are meant to synchronize the decisions and the activities to allow demand and supply balancing to occur in its most simple form. A number of you have embarked on S&OP initiatives. Some of you may not have heard of S&OP, but are likely to do the activities that one would call S&OP if it was defined that way. But I think it's been put in place because we've recognized that supply chain is complex, it's highly interdependent, there are a number of pieces to it, and we have to synchronize all those activities. And so we've invested in that, but as we've said again, we're not necessarily seeing all the results that come from that. Now, there are a whole lot of reasons why this is the case, and there are a whole lot of things we could talk about in terms of supply chain, but what we'd like to do is talk today about one thing that we continue to see as an opportunity out there. And to some extent, it's some of you will say, gosh, I saw GRA talk about this 15 years ago, and we have been talking about this for a while, but we still think it's a real opportunity. And in fact, it's a classic theory of constraints problem, because if we don't address this piece, it's a lot harder for the other benefits to flow through. Okay. So what might that be? Well, let's start with this. This is a graphic from an article in Scientific American. And it was about big data, and it was really about determining or defining the sorts of insights one can derive from big data. Now, the article is more about the problems that might cause and how this has to be regulated and used effectively. But some of the points that come up here I think are really quite amazing. This one said, pregnant but doesn't know it yet. It's actually true that, and this was an article that came out of MIT, they said by doing data analytics they can work out when someone is pregnant, often before they know they are pregnant, because of the changes in behavior. You can also work out and track the spread of a virus in a city, because people's online behavior changes when they get sick. They search for different things, they do different things. So you can actually now track the spread of a virus through a city by watching online behavior. You can also work out whether or not someone's likely to get, more or less likely to get diabetes because of their search behavior and so on. Now, this sort of stuff sounds like science fiction and rocket science, but it's real and it's here. If I sort of pull that up to something that's a little bit more, I guess, prosaic and something that you might be familiar with, is that insurance companies link risk, uncertainty, and variability to cost. This has been happening for a long time. Financial institutions have been looking at the beta distribution and companies' performance, the variability of performance, and saying if it's more variable, we're going to have to discount the value of the business because we can't plan for it. If it's less variable, we're going to give it a higher value. Now, what's interesting is that these are all examples of entities that use data to extract genuine insights and deliver value. Our argument would be we think that this capability is still lacking in supply chains, okay? And we'll explain why that gap exists and what some opportunities might be to improve it. Okay, so if I just talk about, again, each of these pieces, I do want to make the point that we're certainly not putting forward what we're going to be talking about in terms of this planning capability as the silver bullet. There are a number of issues that can exist in this sort of a structure. And if we talk about structure and KPIs, I mean, a pretty common one is the misalignment between influence and incentive. And so what do I mean by that? Again, it's fairly common to see organizations that have a sales team that are incented on driving the top line or gross margin, but not having any kind of financial responsibility for, say, a day-to-day damaged product. So if you're a salesperson and you want to make sure you get your sales, the natural tendency is to make sure you've got the stock, and the natural tendency is then to make sure you've got more stock, not less. But if you don't actually own the impact of having too much inventory, you don't have a counterbalancing incentive to try to get the balance right. So you'll see that in some organizations we don't have the right alignment between incentive and influence. KPIs is an interesting one as well. I'm pretty suspicious. Every time I go to a supply chain conference and someone puts up a graph on this is our service level performance, I largely ignore it because it just depends on how you measure it, right? Is it in units and dollars? Is it on the day? Or is it just the total amount of demand in the month versus what I delivered in the month? I mean, those are all valid measures of service level, and they can get you some very different numbers. So making sure you have the right measures in place is quite important as well. Policies is an interesting one. It's not uncommon to talk to an executive team and to have the MD say, when we were short supply, why did the supply team supply that customer versus that customer? I thought they would have done that. You go talk to the operational team and they say, we'd really love some direction from the executive as to which decisions we can make, and when we have to make trade-offs, what we do. So our view is that most policies you see in organizations guiding supply chain activity tend to be fairly informal and assumed. They're not well defined. We don't have established decision trade-offs, and we don't know necessarily what we're allowed to do. So that's very important if you want to guide the activity in an organization. So S&OP, and these things sort of sit on top of S&OP in our opinion, but what you have in S&OP is you have these well-established processes, but we don't have good planning information to feed into them. Okay, and so that means we don't really have a single set of numbers in a lot of cases. The financial forecast, the unit forecast are different. We don't necessarily have the management levers to trade off cost and service levels. And the reason why we think that we don't have that is because typically the planning capability in a business doesn't provide that sort of information. And the planning capability we're defining as the people, process, systems, and data. I'm sure that's not going to sound new to anybody. We've been using those words for a long time, but I will drill into that in a little bit more. But from a people perspective, it is hard to find talent in demand and supply planning. There are very limited education forms in Australia, and what does a professional planner look like anyway? How do you know? So the 6 degrees guys are nodding furiously, and it's absolutely true. It's a tough question. And I probably should have changed the setting on the computer before the presentation. That would have been an excellent idea for planning. Oops, I've gone backwards. Processes also can be disintegrated, and I'll explain why that's very important here in just a minute. because we've spent maybe a lot of time getting our demand planning process right, but if we actually can't take the value from that and actually have that translate to the next step, then it kind of doesn't matter, and I'll show you why that is in just a moment. I think one of the reasons this has occurred as well is that we've invested heavily in systems that I think, unfortunately, in some cases have actually watered down capability in these areas. So a lot of the ERP systems, for example, will have 65 different configuration settings you can use to run demand and supply planning. And so the team comes in and you spend all this time setting it up and setting up, which replenishment methodologies do we use, and do we want to use step forecasting, what's the beta factor and the gamma factor, and. The consultants leave, 2 years later the business has moved on, everybody's going, now why did we set it up like that again? And in fact, the system's no longer actually tuned to what the business is currently doing. And the problem with those systems, I think, is that they expect you to know how to set them up. They don't actually help give you the answer, so they're not doing the analysis required in a lot of cases. And then on top of that, if we're not using the data we need to use, and this is kind of a key point we want to make, is that we don't think supply chain as a rule uses all the data it needs to use to make decisions, and when we do use it, we're not doing the things to it that we necessarily should. So in that case, we often find that we have unloved data in the supply chain. All right. So again, if we then talk about the planning capability, and we talk about what information do you need to support S&OP, just at a very, very high level, what we'll say is that the step in the demand review process is to say, how do we make sure we take all this market intelligence and translate it into the amount of demand that you see at a product by location level? Does that make sense? Because the point is your customers actually get replenished by product by location. So we have to have the ability to say, now that we've put in our NBT and our promo and uplift, and we've actually looked at scan sales, we've collaborated with our customers, we need to be able to take all that data and make sure it goes down to the right article by the right site. It has to blow down to the detail, because that's actually where you meet your customer. You have to have that link and planning capability and the demand review, and I'll show you in a second why that link gets broken. From an executive level, we have to have the ability, we believe, to say, what are the optimal set of supply chain policies that trade off cost and service level and our constraints? And again, we should know this in advance. And see, that then feeds into the supply reviews. We can say, well, now we know what our demand is. We know what we're actually shooting for in terms of our inventory targets. And now we can supply to that. And we need to have forward visibility to make trade-off decisions around how to allocate stock and how to allocate capacity. And the three processes that then support that are just basically your demand planning process. It's a process or a step we call service level or inventory optimization, and I'll take you through that in a minute, and also the supply review step. Okay. Now, before I really jump into where the opportunities are, I'm just going to do a little bit of, supply chain theory 101. And the first question I'd ask you is, does this rule still apply, the right rule? Kind of a leading question, wouldn't you say? I suppose that's a leading question as well. But the idea is that you're trying to get the right product or service, right place, right time, right cost, and so on. That's still kind of the nirvana we're all after. And according to the textbooks, it should be easy. And so, as Adam mentioned, I used to teach this sort of stuff at Monash. And it was funny, at Monash we were required to use a textbook. And it was really funny because we ended up picking the textbook we hated the least. In other words, I couldn't find one that I really liked, because this is kind of the worldview they present of inventory and how demand and supply matching works. So in other words, this is time, and what happens is we receive a replenishment either from manufacturing or supplier, and demand in a nice linear progressive way steps down predictably, right, to the point that we run out, and as the last unit is being pulled off the shelf, a fresh order comes in at that exact moment in time. Okay? It's just the beautiful ebb and flow of life, It's like dance music. It's wonderful. However, what it really looks like is, well, we're sitting here, and this is what our plan looks like, and so this is what we're going to do. But this is what happens. Now, the sales guys love this. We oversold. We actually got more sales than we thought we were going to get. Supply chain's going, oh no, okay? We're going to run out of stock. That's not so good. There's lots of phone calls, favors are being called in, can you take this supply, anyway. The best case, not from a sales perspective, from the supply chain perspective, is that we undersell. So we have more stock than we thought. Now, we call the distance between those two things is your demand variance, right? So you thought you were going to be here, but you might be here or here. On top of that, from a best case or supply perspective, manufacturing delivers early, or perhaps your supplier delivers early. And if you're short supply, you go, yes, they delivered early. You know, that makes me look a little better from a supply perspective. That worked out well. However, if we've already got too much, then that's just going to further exacerbate things from the oversupply perspective. From the demand perspective, again, if we've oversold, if they deliver late, we're even in a worse position. And if they deliver early, a little bit better. So we thought we were going to end up here, but we could be here or here, right? Okay. Now again, what I'm trying to point out here is that if this was an insurance company, they'd be saying, the variance, this sort of stuff, I'm going to change how much you pay for your policy because I've analyzed this data, and it's going to change how much you're paying. My view would be when we set things like safety stocks, and I'm sorry this is, I know for some of you, really basic stuff, but when we set our safety stocks, we should be doing the same things, right? Safety stock is the insurance about the stuff we don't know in our supply chain, yet we often don't do that, okay? So what that takes us is to a view that says what we actually need is this thing called safety stock. You know, and you guys have heard this word for years, and you guys will be going, oh my gosh, I got up early on a Friday to hear some guy talk about safety stock. I thought I was going to hear about cool, trendy stuff. However, I'm going to, again, explain to you why. There's a real opportunity here. There's a real opportunity here. So what we actually need is safety stock, and that safety stock has to effectively protect us against what we don't know, the uncertainty, based on the level of service we want to provide. Because we can have too much safety stock too, can't we? It has to be the right amount. In addition, when we place an order, when we replenish, we actually want to replenish the right amount. We don't want to replenish too much. In other words, a really from a receiving cost perspective, a really easy way to drive your receiving costs down is for the planner to order a year's worth of stock and go home and come back next year on February 14th and do it all again. And that's kind of efficient on one hand. You could probably take out some labor costs, but you know, finance guys aren't going to like that, are they? You know, your shareholders aren't going to like that. Or you could order a day's worth every day and run the supply chain really hard. There's some other implications with that. So there's some optimal amount to have coming in as well. In our view, it's this part of the process. It's this that's actually supposed to deliver that to you. So then that rolls back up at S&OP, and you know what's going on. Now that's a graphical view. This is now a numerical view. And so when you have planning people sitting in their systems, they're just looking at the total supply by week, the total demand, and saying, how much do I have? And what's happening is right now, you have people sitting out at production sites, at distribution centers, and in planning cells, looking at this number saying, by the end of lead time, I'm going to have minus 10 units. And I'm going to be making, I'm going to spend this business's money. I'm using our assets based on that number. It's what it comes down to at the end of the day. The problem is that what I've just described is that there's a lot of variance in these figures. So that 10 units could be plus 86 or minus 66. That's a very different result. Do you understand? It's the stuff that we don't know that gets us. And the thing is, we're not necessarily considering the stuff that we don't know when we make these decisions. Okay? By the way, please feel free to, before I do that, please feel free to jump in and ask questions. Some people look like they're really getting it. Some people look like they're in a small amount of pain. So for the people in pain, just feel free. Okay. So why is it difficult? The reason why it's difficult, and it's also difficult because that slide has too many words on it and it's very hard to read, so try not to do that. It's difficult because the example I just gave you is a single product in a single location. That's just a few of the things, but on top of this, we've got the new products, we've got promo, we've got uplift, we've got pipe fill, we've got products that are phasing out, we've got Chinese shutdowns for Chinese New Year, we've got constrained manufacturing facilities, we've got to balance costs and so on. We've got different service requirements for different channels. So it is quite complex, and it is. But here's the point, because it's complex, we tend to try to say it's all too much, so we're going to make it simpler. We're going to simplify it. Now, Einstein once said things should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler than that, okay? So what are the things that we do? So in face of all this complexity, what we often do in our demand planning is we tend to aggregate. We look at lots of, we say, well, we've got products selling all over the place, but let's just roll it up to the product level and have a look at it. Now, I'll explain why that maybe does it. It's not so helpful. It's helpful in one way, but it's not helpful in the result. When we set our stocking policy, we still use things like days covers or week's supply, okay? And when we look at supply chain planning, we don't often have the forward visibility we need to make trade-off decisions. So let's just break each of those down. Okay. Why do we use what we call top-down planning? Well, let's say you have two products maybe these are wool coats sold in the northern and southern hemisphere. Well, one's going into the season, one's going out of the season. And if we combine them together into one SKU, we get a demand pattern that looks like that. That's a lot easier to forecast. We only have to forecast one thing versus two things. It's easier. So our forecast accuracy measures look better. There's fewer things to do. The same as an example below. Now, this was something now that seems quite obvious, but sometimes these things are more insidious because sometimes you don't know that your systems are doing this to you. So we talked to one organization that said, right, we've put in place S&OP, we've got a great demand planning team, we've got fantastic demand planners. We've invested heavily in SAP APO. We do it using statistical forecasting. We're reviewing exceptions. We've got buy-in engagement from the sales team. We spend all this time building this beautiful set of numbers, and then at the SKU level. Then we put it, and so the salespeople look, they sign it off, and then we put it into SAP APO. But then APO goes, well, if I'm going to replenish to that, I've got to get that down to the site level. So what I'm going to do in APO is I'm going to look at the total amount of demand each site had, and historically, and apportion the forecast accordingly. So in one site, this particular SKU, now at a site level, went from 0 up to 10,000. In another site, it went from 10,000 down to 0. They both have 50% of the demand. So APO gives both sites the same amount of forecast. Now the salespeople don't see this because this happens in the guts of the system. So what happens is that we have given this location not enough and this one too much. We have not used our resources well. We're going to have write-offs here and we're going to have burnt customers there. And the salespeople are going, but we spent all this time adjusting our forecasts. You told us if we made our forecasts better, life would be better. Woolies is still beating me up. SOP doesn't work. Demand planning doesn't work. This is all crap. Okay? And there's sometimes some little thing sitting back here in your systems that are doing this, that's doing this sort of stuff to you, and it's happening all the time, I promise. Now, the next one is probably goes back to our point before about we don't consider all the things we need to consider when we make our decisions. So a common way still of actually working out how much stock to carry is something called days cover or weeks cover. And there's a whole lot of reasons why we use it, which won't go into that now. But it gives the appearance of being a dynamic figure because as your demand changes, as my sales projections change, I carry more or less stock. So in other words, we increased our forecasts, and so our days cover tells me how much of my forecast I need to carry. So I've increased my forecast. So did stock levels go up? Yes, they did. Good. But now demand has gone down, so my stock levels need to go down. Good. That's everything we need to consider. Now, that would be the same thing as doing economic modeling based on population alone, not taking into account participation, productivity, age of the population. It would also be like, if we use I guess a more relevant example, say demand planning, it would be like saying I could look at my historical sales and forecast off of that and not have to worry about anything else. It's the only thing I need to worry about. Now, none of you would say that would be accurate. When we're working on how much stock we carry, we need to worry about other things. We need to worry about the error in that forecast because that's the insurance policy, right? We know that forecast isn't right. Do we agree? At some level, so that has to go in there. The other thing is the receiving cost. So the cost of getting that product in. If this product is a very heavy, low-margin product, and it's really expensive to bring in, I don't want to be running this thing too fast. I'd rather order more, carry the stock, but run the supply chain not as hard, right? Because that's the best cost trade-off. However, if this is diamonds, in other words, it's small, high margin, easy to move around, I don't want to carry a lot of that stock, so I'm going to replenish that really frequently in small quantities. That makes more sense. So there's cost trade-offs, receiving cost and the holding cost. There's also the level of service. Would we agree that if we want to achieve a 99% in-stock position versus a 92%, we might have to hold more stock? Well, yeah. The point is, we know all this stuff already. And this is the point, you guys know all this stuff already. It's just that if you look at what techniques we're actually using, they don't incorporate these things. There's a guy that used to work for us who's actually here. And he'll be thrilled to know I've been telling the story for many years, but he went off and joined another business, and his boss came to him and said, John, you used to work with GRA, I know you guys do some analysis and this sort of stuff. So he said, we're going to take 2 distribution centers and collapse them into one. And I want to know what the inventory savings associated with that are. Because the theory being, if you take 2 distribution centers and collapse them into one, the demand gets smoother, right? Because you've taken, remember that picture I showed you before? If you collapse it into one, demand gets easier to forecast, so I could actually hold less safety stock. And his boss knew that, and he wanted him to calculate what the reduction in safety stock was. And this individual said, I don't even have to go away and calculate that for you. I can tell you right now. He said, that's amazing. You did that all in your head. He said, there will be no savings. He said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I thought if I put two facilities into one, I'd reduce my demand variability, and I could carry less safety stock. And he said, yes, but we base our stock on weeks cover. He said, you haven't changed the demand. We still have the same amount of demand. So even though, and this is what happens, is people in the business case calculate these things. They say, let's build a smaller shed because we can have less stock. But the way we're actually managing the stock doesn't actually allow the business case value to come through. So there's a mismatch between what we know and what we do. All right? I'll just have to take that as a sign I'm actually going on too long on a given slide. And here's the point, is that if this is the case, because we're not considering all the data elements we should consider, is that, let's say in this example, the amount of variability in our forecast goes up, our customers behave in a more erratic way. It means as that goes up, rather than our stock adjusting to compensate for it, our service levels go down. So we actually inherit the results versus proactively manage them. All right? And then if we realize now that perhaps we're using averaging, implicit averaging in our demand planning, we're not exactly sure if we're holding the right amount of stock, when you get to your supply planning step, we can't really trust the numbers because they're based on averages and they don't have everything included. And so we can't really look into the future and say, where are we going to have too much? Where are we going to have too little? Because it's the going to stuff that is the stuff of life in SOP. A lot of SOP processes will look back in time and say, how did we do and what are we going to do? But our view is that the stuff of life in S&OP comes into saying, where are we going to be? You know, we're going to run out of stock in 6 weeks, but what are we going to do about it now to prevent that from happening? Versus it happens and let's everybody run around and fight fires and solve problems and be heroes because that's hard work. Okay. So the implications is, again, it doesn't give us the ability to make the trade-off decisions. We have trouble translating our market intelligence into a demand plan, and we have trouble looking to the future. So as a result, we inherit the results, and they vary. As James has said, the market dynamics change, then our results change. We deal with inconsistent service levels and costs. We don't have the forward visibility and management levers. And again, the working inefficiently just comes down to we fight fires, we react to outcomes versus control the results. All right. But of course, there is another way. So what good looks like is we would say forecast at a bottom-up level. So in other words, you're forecasting at a lower level and then adding the market intelligence to that. We're using forward-looking replenishment planning methodologies, and we actually set our stocking levels based on an optimization technique. And I'm going to give you an actual example of that here in just a second, because they're all, the slides are lovely and colorful and show movement and have arrows, and it all sounds good. I'm going to show you an actual example of how this might work. Okay. So the trick with this, though, is I mentioned at the start that supply chain framework graphic was an integrated piece. All these things have to be linked. So, and we talked about demand planning, this service and inventory optimization, and supply planning as being the capabilities that feed into each of those SOP meetings. So in demand planning, what you really have to have is you have to have the demand plan, and the other thing is the amount of expected error in that plan. And I won't go into that into too much detail. But the point is when you create a forecast, what I actually want to know is roughly how wrong is that forecast going to be? Because if I know roughly how wrong it's going to be, I can actually calculate the amount of stock I need to carry to cover that. Which means that if we reduce our forecast error, we get a benefit in improved forecasting. If we don't have that link, we don't. So that capability has to kind of be nested within the demand review process. Within the executive review, we have to be able to take that demand variability, the supply variability, and our supply chain cost constraints, and then set our service level goal, and then have all of that be used to work out what our target stock levels are. This is real, by the way. I mean, this does work and does happen. And once we then know what our target stock is and our demand is at this article site level, we can then do supply chain planning to let us know how our demand and supply match into the future. Okay? And it also means, for example, as I said before, that if the error increases in your demand plan, but we want our service levels to stay consistent, the safety stock will have to increase, and then we might have to purchase a bit more inventory to keep us out of trouble. And all the links are there, none of them are broken. Okay? Okay, so let me give you this a quick example of this inventory optimization piece. And as I mentioned before, trying to work out how much stock to carry is a balance between basic storage and flow costs. Sometimes people say, what's the definition of supply chain? And there are lots of textbook definitions that go on for a couple of paragraphs with no punctuation. And by the time you finish, you're just thrilled that you actually made it without passing out. The simplest definition in my mind is just the optimization of storage and flow in its most basic form. That's what supply chain management's all about. But you have to also base that on, you have to base it on the ability to press the right button on your clicker and availability and responsiveness. So our view is that there is an optimal point for every item in every location. It can be different for every item in every location. If you have more than that, then you've actually got resource invested that is not delivering you any return. If you've got less than that, you've got upset customers, you're rescheduling, expediting stuff in, and so on. Now, I'm now going to apologize for this next piece because this might be a little bit hard to read, and I have to stand in the hum zone. Okay. So again, apologies for what I'm about to do to you. This is an example that's meant to show the difference between two approaches. So what we have here is a single item. So just follow me. I will explain this. We have a single item. This item sells 20,000 units a year. Okay? It's one item in one location. Its manufacturing cost, or its purchase cost, don't care, is $15. Okay? Every time I place an order for replenishment, the manufacturing and transportation costs, everything to get it in, it costs me $50 an order. Okay? There's a cost associated with getting it here. When I go to the supermarket, if it's down the street, there's one cost, but I live on a mountain and it takes me 3.5 days. My receiving cost for going to the supermarket is greater. So when I go to the supermarket, I'm going to buy more stuff. Makes sense, right? It's kind of common sense. The carrying cost is the cost associated with having the stock. If we have stock, well, we are exposed to things like depreciation. We've got capital tied up that's not adding value. There's an opportunity cost with that. So there's a cost associated with holding it. So there are these two opposing costs we're trying to balance. At the same time, we want to try to achieve a service level. That 0.96 is actually a 96% service level. That's what I want to achieve. We then have the error in my, so that's the demand variability. Don't worry about the numbers so much. And the supply variability, which says I know there's a certain amount of error. And this is my lead time. Now, the inventory optimization approach is going to consider all of those things when working out what my stocking policies are. When I place an order, my order quantity and my safety stock. We also have, by contrast, the weak supply approach, okay, that says the weak supply approach really only cares about how much demand there is, because that's all it's based on. So in other words, as my demand goes up, well, my weak supply, the quantity will change. And the purpose of this exercise is to then compare and contrast what do these two approaches deliver us. So this is the optimal approach, and this is the weeks cover approach. They both give us 15 turns. They both give us about $20,000 in average inventory, and they both give us about 300 grand in annual cost. There's no difference, is there? Surely there must be a difference. Well, because this is a carefully crafted example, and I've done it probably 3,000 times, it's not that straightforward. Have a look at the safety stock. There's actually, and this is why inventory management is so bloody annoying and complex. It's that, the accountants would say you've got the same amount of stock, but you actually don't. You've got a different relationship between how often you replenish and how much insurance stock you carry. Do you see that? So the weak supply is saying, hey, order larger amounts, but don't hold as much safety stock. The optimal approach is saying, order small amounts, but hold more safety stock. So it's not fair to say that both approaches deliver the same service level. That's the trick. So what I'm going to do is, because again, I know the answer, I'm going to go back while leaning over here to avoid the hum and change that from 96 to 93. And in doing that, you can see now that my safety stock units, see that, are now roughly equivalent. And so what I'm actually saying is, I didn't know this up front, but my weeks coverage policy was actually going to get me a 93% service level. I just didn't know that because it wasn't linked to that calculation. And in fact, if I'm happy to run my optimal at a 93% service level, I can run with 16% less inventory and increase my turn rates by 3. You see? Let's look at another example. And remember, this is one item in one location. Most of you guys have hundreds of items in multiple locations, if not thousands. We helped Super Retail Group put in this sort of techniques into Super Cheap Auto. They use this for every article in every store. 3.5 million item location combination. So it does work, and it is real. So we now have a question. We would like to outsource this item. And right now we've got a 7-week, now please excuse the number, but it's a 7-week lead time. We're going to get a lower unit cost by moving this overseas, but we then need to figure out what does that mean in terms of the amount of safety stock that I need to hold. Now, when I change this next number, I want you to watch what happens here and what happens here. And this is important because the trick in supply chain managers is about making sure there are no broken links. I'm going to change 7 to 12, and all of a sudden we can see that the optimization approach said, uh-oh, lead time has changed, and because lead time has changed, the amount of variability. So let me just undo that. You see, when I change my lead time, the amount of variability in my supply chain goes up. Okay, because I've got more risk in my supply chain now. Do you see that? I've got more risk. So because I have more risk, I need to hold more stock. And in fact, by moving this thing offshore, I now need to hold about 45% more inventory than I did before. Now, what I used to teach this in the Monash course, and what I used to get the students to do is say, so now tell me what sort of price I need to achieve on that item to balance that out. In other words, if I'm going to do that, at some point, it doesn't make sense to offshore it if the additional cost of inventory outweigh the margin benefit you get on the item. Does that make sense? So I can now do that. And what I find a little bit sad is that this spreadsheet will do more than most multi-million-dollar ERP systems because of the way they've been set up. And so we just don't have that capability. So I just wanted to give you that example of showing you that you can take more of the inputs in making decisions. They can be fact-based, and you can actually know the implications of what you're doing from a business case perspective before you start, and that's the real power. Okay, so, and again, if we don't do that, again, if we use that, say, weak supply in a dynamic environment, what happens is we struggle to control the outcomes. We have too much or too little. Now, I just want to just walk you through a quick little example. This was, so this is just an example of kind of what happens out there, and it was really quite telling of the comment of the person at the last step of the chain. But this was a business that had fantastic people, really, really switched on marketing people, sales people, supply chain planners, master production schedulers, and production schedulers. And we actually followed their S&OP and planning process physically and from an information perspective. And they had a process that probably had, at kind of a higher level, about 12 steps. It was supported by APO. And it kind of went something like this. So we talked to the sales team, and the sales team said, so we get the Nielsen data, scan data, customer by SKU by week. We've got all this detail. And then they said, okay, we've got that. What do you do next? They said, well, we know Woolies ordering rules. Kind of went, So they said, we shifted all 2 weeks. And I thought, there's the first forecast, first assumption we've made in the process. Then we do that. Then we add some market intelligence to it. And then we aggregate that to a family level. And then we add NPD, promo, and uplift. And we add all that together. So now we've got that at a family level. And then for our SOP process, we have to take this weekly view and convert it into a monthly view. So we do that. We put it in this other system, and it consolidates into a monthly view. And then we review that with the team. The MD says, oh, we're going to make contract. We have to adjust that up and down at a monthly view. And again, what they then did to split it back down to a family level was the system said, I'm going to use a 3-month moving average. And it's averaged it out and split it back down. And then APO said, to get it down to a site level, I'm going to split it into equal buckets in the week. And it blew my mind. I thought, I went through this process. This is a big cycle, big system, smart people. And the production planner showed me this picture. He said, this is what the system spit out that I'm supposed to produce. But I know somebody in headquarters knows this isn't right. That was the sum total of their planning. All that investment was to turn that, to turn this. It's just such a good build-up, isn't it? To turn this into this. And it was quite sad. in the sense that there was knowledge that the systems were actually destroying value and the processes were taking things away, not adding to them. And this is a very big, very high-profile FMCG, global FMCG business, and this stuff goes on all the time. Okay, so our view is if you can get all this stuff right, if you can kind of integrate it and get the data to feed into this process, you're in a significantly different position from a competitive advantage. You know what's going to happen. You have the ability to control the outcomes versus inherit them. It's a huge, huge competitive advantage. That same company that that example is from, if you then aggregated that up and said, if we do some analysis at a business level, what this is actually saying is that there was an opportunity to take 18 to 33% of the inventory out, but increasing the service levels from 92 to 98%. And that doesn't sound possible. But if you remember the example of the system was putting stock too much and too little at the same time, you actually find you can get a lift in level of service and still take cost and stock out. And the other thing is you then, and I think this is probably one of the key competitive advantages, is having a fact-based view of what your cost or investment to service curve looks like. You can actually now calculate that and say, I know what I have to invest to achieve greater or lesser levels of service. And if I want to make a change, in other words, what if I reduce my lead time? I can see how that cost curve changes. If I change my manufacturing batch sizes, how does that cost curve change? If I want to increase my service to my customer, what do? Can't afford it, could I actually reduce it to a C customer, increase it for an A? It becomes very powerful. And this is the sort of stuff you hear people talk about in SOP. This is what you should be able to do in SOP, but we can't do it in a lot of cases because we just don't have the information. And again, it is real. So this is just an example of 5 businesses where we've seen these sorts of techniques applied. And you'll see the working capital reductions ranging up to 26%. But at the same time, all of these come with service level improvements as well. So that's what we mean. It has a multiplier effect on return on capital employed. All right, I'm not going to go through these in any detail at all, but we'll send this presentation around to 6 Degrees and they can distribute it to you guys. But this just gives you some checklists to go back into your business with and say, kind of, where do we think we are? The first checklist is really more of one that says, is there an opportunity? So in other words, if you're experiencing symptoms like promotions leading to stockouts, if we're having issues clearing or deteriorating or aged inventory and so on, then these are some of the symptoms of a process that might need some support. This then becomes the view of S&OP maturity. So like anything, once you start the S&OP journey, there are a number of stages to take it on its evolution. If you have a look at the people, process, systems, and data, this will give you a view at each stage of what some of those critical requirements are, and you can give yourself a bit of a score for, I kind of think I'm in this section or this section. And then what we've talked about before is this is the planning capability that sits below it. So also matched to each of those levels, what are we actually doing from a planning perspective to support that? And we might look at then mismatches between how we're doing in a SOP level, and then what sort of information support we have. And lastly, this just gives you a little bit of a view of what the business case might be in specific areas by achieving best practice planning and then enhancing the SOP process as a result. So in summary, as James opened up by saying, the mix is changing, the market's changing, products, categories, sourcing geographies are changing. The opportunity to use data or big data is here. In supply chain, our view is that we're not using all the data we could be using. And when we are using the data, we might be oversimplifying it, which means that as the market conditions change, our results change. We're not staying ahead of the cost optimization curve in that sense. Okay? Whether we end up spending time reacting and firefighting versus controlling outcomes. Our view is, and again, there are lots of things going on here, but we just wanted to talk about this one point. And one of my other partners always makes this comment. He says, an ounce of planning is worth a pound of execution. Make sense? An ounce of planning is worth a pound of execution. So if you can actually work out where to get, if you can get the right rule right, you don't end up redistributing product all over your network and taking your margins out. So it's very powerful, and we think it's one of the key opportunities in terms of unlocking the benefits from the investments you've already made in your supply chain, that you've already made. It's there. The great thing about this opportunity as well is that you don't have to win new customers, you don't have to change your product mix, you don't have to renovate products. That opportunity typically exists in the business now. It's just changing how we use our information to make decisions that can actually unlock this capability. So it's quite powerful. So hopefully you've heard some things today that, as James said before, will allow you to at least go back and ask some questions in your business. And thank you for your time and patience. Any questions?